I'm Brant-Gardner, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Brant-Gardner on the show. You know, he's a Book of Mormon expert, and he's come out with not just one, but two new books on the Book of Mormon. So we're going to talk about these books. One of them is a retranslation of the Book of Mormon, if you will, the Brant-Gardner Translation. And the other is a commentary. So we're going to find out more about the Book of Mormon with Brant-Gardner. Check out our conversation. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm so excited. I ran into a good friend and who's kind of a stranger at first because, anyway, I feel embarrassed. But we met at Education Week this week, and I said, you're in town. We've got to get together and talk because our last interview was over the internet.
Yeah.
And I'm a guy, I like to be in person. So could you go ahead and tell us who you are?
I can do that. Brant-Gardner. I'm from Albuquerque, not Orem or Provo, which is why the last one was on Zoom. And we're sitting here because I do Book of Mormon things.
Yes.
And so the particular impetus, I guess, is we actually put out two books at once with Gopher Books.
Yeah.
Which frankly was a really difficult editorial process to have. I mean, getting one book out kind of is a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
But to have two of them coming out simultaneously was, we're not going to do that again.
Yeah.
That was enough.
We'll dive into that in just a second. I have to tell you, it was funny because we were at BYU Education Week. And of course, you know, I was talking to Kurt Frankham and he goes, wow, you're really branding with your shirts and a hat. And I had a big Gospel Tangents t-shirt. And, because me and Brent, we'd never met in person before. And, you know, I'd only seen you on the screen.
Yeah.
And so you recognized me. I walked in the room and then you came up after the class. And I was like, now this guy looks really familiar. How do I know him? I could tell you knew me. And then I saw your name. Brant-Gardner, we finally meet in person. So I'm an opportunist, if anything. And if somebody's in town, we got to talk. So thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you for being here. This is awesome.
That's fun.
Very, very fun.
And better to do it in person. It's nicer.
Yeah, it's way nicer. It sounds better. It looks better. Everything's better. So it's just a lot more work. But that's the bad thing about the internet is it makes it simple and easy. But
oh, yeah.
I like to do things hard and complicated. So which book do you want to talk about first that you've just published?
I guess what I have to do is sort of introduce both of them simultaneously,
okay.
And then you can decide which one to start on.
Okay.
So the two things that we have, one of them is called Plates of Mormon. All of these things have subtitles that I do not remember,
okay.
Just so people know. There is something that goes after Plates of Mormon, but that's all I remember.
That's good.
It's
too long to fit on the title anyway.
Yeah, and never said exactly what I wanted it to say, and you know. So one of them's called Plates of Mormon, and the other is called Engraven Upon Plates, Printed Upon Paper.
Okay.
So those are the two. Now, what are the two? What's the right way to do it? Let me start with Engraven.
Okay.
The Engraven book began with some ideas that I've been kicking around for a long time, looking at what I would call the production culture of the Book of Mormon, which means what was the culture like of whoever it was that wrote this text? And one of the things that, oddly enough, Latter-day Saints tend not to admit is that there is a 19th century production culture. Now, we know that there is because it's written in English. You know, it's not written in whatever Nephi was. But for some reason, we want to shy away from that and not talk about the fact that it was produced at that time, and that there are artifacts in the text that show that that's part of the production culture. But that's the translation layer of it. And so what I wanted to do after that is say, okay, well, let's move down from the translation layer and look at the layer of the authors of the text. What were they doing? What can we tell about them? How did they write? Why did Mormon stop chapters when he stopped chapters? Why are paragraphs not there? What do we do with those? And so it's sort of the the meat of how they actually constructed what elements of the text belong to the authors. And so we can talk more about them, but some of those are parallelistic poetry, diphrastic kennings. What are some of the others?
Diphrastic what?
Diphrastic kennings.
How do you spell that? I don't even know what that means.
Well, that's because I suppose it's one of the terms that Mesoamericanists get to because it happens so much in Mesoamerican literature. Diphrastic for dual, DIPH,
Okay.
and a kenning for an understanding. So there's an understanding of two things
Ken
that
Jennings,
go
you
together.
just shrink it together, kenning?
These are two words that always go together.
Okay.
So in the Book of Mormon, the one I'm remembering immediately is gold and silver. So you read gold and silver, and as soon as you read gold and silver, our minds go to the metals and to the value of the metals. And in the Book of Mormon, it doesn't quite work that way. Those two always go together. It's always a pair. You really don't talk about gold and then silver separately until you get to the weights and measures thing, and that's totally different. But anyway. But gold and silver function as a set. The two words go together, and they do indicate wealth, but we should read it as wealth, not as they have a lot of gold and they have a lot of silver. They are wealthy, and whatever it was they were wealthy in may never have had anything to do with gold or silver.
Really?
Yeah. Well, and particularly, frankly, anywhere in the New World. If you are anywhere in the New World, your wealth would not be measured by gold and silver.
So like Daddy Warbucks kind of a thing?
You measure it by the land that you have, the accumulation of rich goods, but it would be things like blankets and rich clothing and clothing from other locations and if you're in central Mexico, having quetzal feathers that come out of Guatemala was wonderful. If you're in the Anasazi, having the macaw that's coming out of central Mexico but had to be imported into the Anasazi in southwest U.S., that was a prestige item because not everybody had a macaw or the macaw feathers. You had to have this long line of transmission or trade to get it. Those things made you wealthy.
Okay.
Gold and silver were nice because you could make things out of them. They were malleable. And so you could make pretty ornaments out of them, but you didn't have gold and silver to demonstrate wealth. That's a very European thing. So there was a lot of gold around, which is why the Spaniards, came in and took it all. But for the Native Americans, it was not real high. If you really wanted to know what the highest value was, the highest value mineral object was jade. That was the most high prestige. And we would say, okay, well, gold. Well, their gold was jade. The other thing that they traded that was highly valuable were cacao beans, chocolate.
Yeah.
And that was very valuable. But yeah, gold and silver, not so much. We have this really wonderful document that the natives made for the Spaniards that was talking about all of the tribute that was brought into to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital in Mexico City. And they're bringing in all kinds of things. And some of them is logs. But they do bring in gold and silver, but it's among this big catalog of things that are coming in. And it's like gold and silver bars because I can make things out of them. But in the Book of Mormon, those two words go together to say wealth, but not necessarily wealth because they had those two things, which is a really long aside. But that's what diphrastic kennings are.
Okay.
They're two words that go together, and the meaning comes from the combination of the words, not the words themselves.
Okay. I know some people are probably going to be like, he's just saying that because there's no gold and silver or something. I don't know.
I mean, there was obviously gold and silver all over the place.
Okay.
And later on they use it. And I think one of the things that Nephi did to create a society that people wanted to belong to is he had some metalworking skills, and I suspect he took soft metal like gold and silver, and he made things out of it that somebody would like. But you don't make, well, yeah, the tumbagi. Yeah, and as far as things that are still questions for the Book of Mormon, metallurgy at the correct time period is probably the last one. Everything else, I think we've got the right things in the right places in the right time. Metallurgy, we're still a little, it arrives there later, according to the archaeological record. It's very close by in the right time period. It's within a few hundred miles to the south, but it hasn't, to our knowledge, to archaeological knowledge, hasn't made it up. But he's making things that are decorative. Gold isn't terribly useful. Make a gold sword. Yeah, that's really dumb because, it's soft. Yeah. What are you going to cut with a gold sword? And the same thing with silver. These are nice soft metals, and you can make objects with them, but they're not very functional. You don't change society and the way you work. You do not make plows out of silver. And that's not because it's too valuable. It's because it doesn't work. It's too soft.
Right.
So anyway, that's where the gold and silver comes in as a diphrastic cutting. Okay. All right. I was talking about the book.
Okay. Sorry.
There's a long tangent. Gospel tangents, exactly. Right? Book tangents now. So that whole book was looking, and then I do the next one down, which is what sources were the authors working with and how do they use those sources. And there's some, I think, really interesting things about how Mormon uses the sources that are available to him and what we can tell about that. So that's this book. Plates of Mormon basically reformats the Book of Mormon using all of the information that is more fully described in the Engraven Upon Plates book.
Okay.
So that book lays out how things are done. And then the other one says, well, this is what it would look like if you do it that way. So here's where Plates of Mormon came from. It actually was just a side project that I started because I was interested. Joseph Smith Papers acquired the printer's manuscript.
Right.
And
my Community of Christ friends are still sad about that.
Well, yeah, for the same reason we're celebrating, they're not.
Exactly.
I certainly understand. Our gain is their loss.
Yes.
But one of the things that they did is to create a transcript. And of course, if you have the published version, the paper version, which is wonderful, if you are any kind of a scholar on the Book of Mormon, you have to have this thing. But in addition to the paper, they published their transcript of the printer's manuscript electronically. And enterprising people could download it. So I did. And I did, by the way.
It's out of copyright now, right? It's
I filled out all of the forms that they asked you to publish this, and it says, wait 6 months. They never wrote back.
Oh.
So I did try to get official permission, but now it's forgiveness time. So, but for those who may or may not understand about the printer's manuscript, when Joseph is dictating, the scribes are writing. They are writing free form.
Right.
So there's no paragraphs.
Punctuation.
There's no punctuation.
No capitalization, no anything. Run-on sentences.
It's not correct to say there's no capitalization.
Oh, okay.
There is random capitalization. Capitals, in some cases, it's almost Germanic, where certain nouns are capitalized.
Oh.
Just because it's a noun.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I was talking to Robert Jensen once, and he says, you should go back and look and see which scribe it was that did that, because was it the Whitmers that had a Germanic background?
Oh.
And maybe that's how that got in there, which I haven't done. But
wait, didn't one person write the printer's manuscript?
No, there were multiple scribes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's the hands of several scribes in there. So, Joseph dictates to Oliver, and that gives us the original manuscript.
Okay.
But after the loss of the 116 pages, they said, oh no, backup. I need my backups. And so the printer's manuscript comes as the backup.
Okay.
And then they had different
We're not going to lose this again, Martin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I didn't talk about that in that book. There's a different book where I talked about what I think was in the lost pages, what we can reconstruct of what was there, and what I think wasn't there. Yeah, and I think understanding what isn't, would not have been there is just as interesting as knowing what might have been there.
We might have to see your critique of Don Bradley here in a minute. We'll continue.
We can keep going. You've got hours. So what I looked at this and I said, well, John Gilbert took this text and they handed it to him without sentences or anything else. And they said, make a book out of this. And John Gilbert had never read the Book of Mormon. I've read the Book of Mormon way more times than John Gilbert has ever done it.
Uh-huh.
There are things I understand about the text that John Gilbert never. How would I do it?
And for people who don't know who John Gilbert is.
Oh, he's the compositor. Sorry about that. Yeah, he's the compositor at Grandin Press.
The printer.
The printer. And so this is the guy at the printer's office where they handed the manuscript to him and said, okay, turn this into text, put paragraphs in there. So the person who created the paragraphs and created the sentences for the Book of Mormon was not a Latter-day Saint, did not believe in the Book of Mormon. His job was to take this text that had nothing and
make it readable.
And he was a man of the 1830s, and the dictation was oral, and it has long, convoluted, all kinds of wild sentences in it. And so he did the best he could, but he also, people in the 1830s were not bothered by a sentence that went on for a paragraph. We do not like those.
No.
As modern people. We prefer our sentences a little bit shorter and a little more succinct. And so I said, let me try my hand at this. And
so you took the printer's manuscript and re-punctuated it?
I re-punctuated it. I re-paragraphed it.
Wow.
And one of the things that I had done, going back to how these two books fit together and the reason why they came out at the same time, I had talked about the fact that there were no paragraphs in the original, but that doesn't mean that there were no textual flow markers.
Okay.
So in an ancient language where you don't have punctuation, you still have to let people know. If you are speaking to someone, your pauses tell people how to understand what it is that you're saying. So we always have ways to do it, and if it's a language we understand, we know where the words are divided. We know where the sentences are divided. We hear by the intonation of the voice when the sentence is going to end, or a question mark at the end. And different languages do things differently, but if you're going to print that, how do you tell someone? Well, we have this ubiquitous form in the Book of Mormon called it, "And it came to pass." And I started looking at that and I said, well, this is a textual flow marker. And we have known for a long time that, that this shows up in the historical sections. For example, it's all over the book of 1 Nephi. It's all over the first 5 chapters of 2 Nephi. And then it goes away. And when you get to the end where Nephi is riffing on Isaiah, and talking to the future and doing theology at the end of 2 Nephi, you don't have that and came to passes. They're not there. Well, why not? Well, because they are part of the historical context and they move your text through time. And so when you get an "and it came to pass," then the next "and it came to pass" says, you've now moved in time. Things have shifted. This is an historical record. We're moving along now. And then I found another one, which was...
So those would be paragraph markers, essentially.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, because they show up so often, if you use them as a paragraph marker, you will get some very short paragraphs that are like a small sentence. But I did it that way in Plates of Mormon. I said, this makes a difference.
So did you reversify it, basically?
I left the verses in there because
They're
how are you going to
historical?
find it?
Yeah.
I mean, we know what these verses are as Latter-day Saints. You know, if I want to find Mosiah 3:19, I got to go find Mosiah 3:19. They're in there because. So all of the apparatus for a verse I put in so that people could find them, but they're inside of paragraphs.
Okay.
It turns out that most of the verses, that there weren't very many verses where I combine sentences and there's a verse where the verse number shows up in the middle of the sentence. That doesn't tend to happen. But certainly across paragraphs, there are places where I break the verses very differently. So the verse number is in there, but yeah, it's not going to be laid out exactly.
And so when
the
you
same
get into
way.
like the Hebrew poetry, you make it look like a poem.
I make it, I try to do that.
Yeah.
I am not necessarily a poet. I've tried to do that. I confess that I looked very heavily at Grant Hardy's,
Okay.
the way he had done the Isaiah. And then there were a couple of places where I'm looking through Grant Hardy's work, and Grant put a few things in prose where I said, I don't think that's supposed to be prose. I think that's still. And so I went to Robert Alter's. In
the Bible, the Isaiah
Bible,
parts you're talking about.
I'm going to Robert Alter's translation of Isaiah, which is all poetry, which is, by the way, fantastic for people who don't know Robert Alter and his translation of the Hebrew Bible.
Well, and I would just mention where I saw you was in Ben Spackman's Education Week, and Ben was amazing because he talked a lot about Robert Alter in the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah.
So that was a fantastic.
Yeah. So I went to Robert Alter and I said, well, how did he put it? And so I stole from Robert Alter. Of course I did. I'm not dumb.
You're proud of it.
I mean, come on, I'll give credit where credit's due. And I am pretty sure that in the introduction to that one, I think I gave credit. I should have. But yeah, things are marked off. And one of the things that I did that I find very useful in understanding the Book of Mormon, and we have not recognized as well as I believe we should, are places where either Nephi or Mormon put an aside in, where they've got a text that they've got a story they're telling, and for some reason they kind of go off to the side and then they'll come back. Nephi does this when something he is writing triggers an idea or a memory or something, and then he kind of goes off on whatever that thing was that he just wrote, and then at some point he goes, okay, now back to what I was talking about. Yeah. And Mormon does a lot of the same thing. There's inserted text. Now, this concept that happens a lot where you can tell what these insertions are called repetitive resumption. That's how you get back, is you take whatever sentence you had at the beginning and pick it up at the end. I want to talk about that because I think that, for me, is one of the more fascinating things that is in this Engraven Upon Plates book. But to finish up
which one's which? One of them, so we were talking this week, and you told me that one of the books, you started in Mosiah, you did it in translation order. So first and second Nephi are at the end. Which book is that?
Plates of Mormon.
What's the Plates of Mormon?
So the one that's coming from the printer's manuscript.
Okay.
As we were pulling it together, I was talking to Lloyd Erickson, who's doing the editing and is with Koford Books. And we're exchanging this information. And somewhere along the line, I said, we misread parts of the Book of Mormon because we start with the small plates. Okay. And we don't start with Mormon. And so a lot of the mental assumptions we make about the Book of Mormon begin with Nephi, and we carry them over into what Mormon did. But that isn't the way Mormon was using the ideas or the concept or what Mormon was doing. For example, Lamanites. What Mormon is doing with Lamanites is significantly different than what Nephi is doing with Lamanites. But we learn about Lamanites with Nephi, and we carry those ideas over, and we interpret Mormon through Nephi's eyes. And that's, I think, wrong. I think that does a disservice to Mormon's message, which actually goes into a reason why I ended up writing the other book. But to finish up on this one. So what we did in Plates of Mormon, we said, okay, well, let's change that. Let's have people experience the text closer to the way it should have been, which is, let's start with Mormon's book. This is the Book of Mormon. Let's start with Mormon, which is Mosiah, because that's what we have. So we put in a place marker for the Book of Lehi, and then we put a place marker in for the first unknown number of chapters that we've lost out of Mosiah.
We think it's 2 or 3, right?
Skousen said it's probably 2 lost chapters, and the reason he said that is in the printer's manuscript at the beginning of Mosiah, there are 3 vertical slash marks, like Roman numeral 3, and then 2 of them are crossed out to give you one, chapter 1. And he said, oh, well, what this was originally then is it was going to be chapter 3, and then they took the 2 off. Unfortunately, that doesn't actually work. If you go through the rest of the printer's manuscript, you find out that the Book of Omni was, is it Omni? Yeah, Omni was 1. Words of Mormon was 2. And then we get the Book of Mosiah 3.
Oh.
But you also have to remember that these numbers were put on after the printer's manuscript was already finished. So it has nothing to do with the original. They're going through and putting the numbers on. And when they're doing it, they misread how Omni, Words of Mormon, and Mosiah fit together. And so you had the 1, 2, 3, and then you said, oh, wait a second, no, this is 1, and this isn't 3, it's 1. So we have lost chapters, and frankly, it wouldn't surprise me if we've lost 2 chapters, but it might be more. There's I think, a reconstructible pieces of information where I think we can know what should have been and what we lost.
Because Joe Spencer, he was on my podcast a few months ago, he believes that Mosiah chapter 1 is Mosiah chapter 1, that we didn't lose any of Mosiah.
Yeah, and I had a chance to talk to him just ever so briefly about that, and he says, I'm still working on the argument, I'm still getting it down on paper, so there's no place for me to read it, and this was at the end of class, and he had to go somewhere else, and so there was no time to talk about it, and he and I are going to need to discuss that for a long time.
But you're going to come to Bombs in October?
I have not yet planned on doing that.
Let me twist your arm.
It's free. I live in Albuquerque.
I know.
I live in Albuquerque. Actually, do you remember what days the Bombs is? It's in October.
Here, I can look it up on the calendar, but it's the week after General Conference, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
They kind of do that on purpose, and anyway, it's a Friday,
I have
Saturday,
been there before.
Basically.
Yeah, I've been there before.
You should come again.
It's an interesting set of people. It's kind of not my set of people because our interests are just not quite close enough together.
Okay, it's October 11th and 12th. Well, actually, Thursday night, the 10th, they have a Jana Reese is speaking. So you probably love Jana Reese. You got to come Thursday night. I'm going to be flying home. I'm going to miss Jana, which I feel terrible. But I will hopefully be there. Oh, yeah, my Friday's kind of messed up. Friday afternoon, I hope. It might just be Saturday for me. But anyway.
Yeah. Oddly enough, I am going to be up here. There's an interpretive thing that they want me to come to that is on
So there's 2 reasons
Thursday.
to come.
So
okay. Good.
All right. Well, yeah, I'll think about it. But anyway, the upshot of the discussion I had with Joe is I said, we do need to talk about this because we disagree. I said, we significantly disagree on this topic. And because I have not seen his argument,
it's hard to
I
argue
cannot tell you why he's wrong. Other than I can tell you the reasons why I think the concept is wrong, whatever his argument is. And part of that, because it's gospel tangents, we are now on another tangent.
All right. You're a great messenger here.
nothing if not tangents if you're going to talk to me. But this actually does go back to it because it's one of the things that I talk about in the Engraven Upon Plates book, because that's the one that says, how is the book written? So here is a question that every once in a while we ask, and we usually answer a little too simplistically and definitely incorrectly. Why are the Books of Mormon named for people?
Okay.
And if they're going to be named for people, particularly when you get to the text that Mormon wrote, how come there's so many different people inside the book that aren't the same person that wrote the book? So in the book of Mosiah, well, we can't do that because I'm talking about the beginning, and that's flipping the argument around. But still, even in the book of Mosiah as we have it, who's the first character that shows up?
King Benjamin.
Benjamin, not Mosiah, Benjamin. So when we think of the book of Mosiah, we always think of Mosiah, the grandson, Mosiah 2, because that's the only Mosiah we have. But why isn't it the book of Benjamin?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I've wondered that.
Oh, well, I'll tell you. I'll let you know.
Okay.
So inside the book of Mosiah, we have Benjamin and Mosiah. And then we get Alma. But not Alma the elder, only Alma the younger. And inside the book of Alma the younger, we have Alma the younger and Helaman, his son. Well, we have a book of Helaman, but it's not that Helaman, it's that Helaman's son. So the book of Alma has Alma and Helaman, and the book of Helaman has Helaman and Nephi, and that Nephi becomes the third Nephi, so we have a separate book, but this is the same guy, and then we have a fourth, okay? Saying that the books are written, they have the name of the person who wrote them, really misunderstands the text, fundamentally misunderstands. And it goes back to the fact that Mormon is looking at the large plates. And what we understand from the very beginning, from what Nephi says, the small plates have a significantly different purpose. And for what we need to understand right now, we need to know what the other plates were like, what we call the large plates. He said, those are the reigns of the kings. This is the official record. This is the reigns of the kings. This is what the kings write down. This is what their official records are all about. And that's what Mormon is using. I've seen people say that Mormon used the small plates. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. I don't think he did. He liked them, and he said, yeah, I think we should include them. There is evidence that he read them, but never used them. By the time he found them, he'd already written everything that covered what those plates had. There was no reason for him to write anything based on the small plates. He'd already finished it. He was moving on. He was already on Benjamin. He finished all that stuff. So all of this stuff where we look back and says, oh, he copied this out of the small plates. Nah, never did that. So back to the large plates. These are official records. Why do they change? Well, let's start with the book of Lehi. We forget about that because it's missing. The book of Lehi, Nephi wrote, named it for his father, which is a very nice thing to do. How many different writers did you have in the book of Nephi that covered from Nephi, the original Nephi, up until whichever Mosiah we have? We got 400 years. Yeah, there's a few people that show up in 400 years. But there's only one name on the book. And then it changes. Well, why does it change? If you've been doing this for 400 years, why do you change? It's a dynastic change. We have Mosiah the first who leaves the Nephi. They leave behind whatever that was, and we start a new political dynasty in Zarahemla. And whether or not Mosiah had anything to do with royalty in the land of the Nephites, when you get to Zarahemla, it's a new people. You've got two people coming together. This is a very different thing. Start a new book. Okay, what happens at the end of the book of Mosiah? End of the kings. What happens at the beginning of the book of Alma? Reign of the judges, new dynasty. Things have changed. Then it gets a little complicated, but the plates, that tradition of plates, Alma had kept because Nephihah said, I don't want to do that, you do that. Those plates come back into the royal line when Alma's grandson, Helaman, is seated as the king. And so the book of Helaman is because Helaman is seated as the king. And then things fall apart, and we have Nephi. But when we get into 3rd Nephi, the significant political information about 3rd Nephi is that the Nephi government falls apart. You have no Nephites anymore. Everything's down into tribes. And so the government falls apart. And that's why you have to have a book of 4th Nephi, because that's where things get going again. So these books change, the book names change because of dynasties.
Well, that's interesting because especially when we're looking at translation order, did it say 3rd Nephi and 4th Nephi?
Oh, no, not at all.
Okay.
No, it's Nephi the son of Helaman, and then Nephi the son of, in the 3rd Nephi, it's, I may mention that he's the son of Helaman, but, Nephi the apostle, basically. And then for 4th Nephi, it's, Nephi the son of Nephi. And so it gives you the genealogy, but you never get the 3 and 4.
Okay, so is that basically John Gilbert going, well, got 1st and 2nd Nephi here, I got to make this 3rd Nephi and 4th Nephi? Is that what's happening?
I think that actually may have happened after Gilbert put that on.
Oh, okay.
Because he wouldn't have added those in.
Because they should be 1st and 2nd, and 1st and 2nd should be 3rd and 4th.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you
wise anyway.
I mean, if you go back to Mormon, and in my mind, I'm always separating Mormon from the small plates, because they function so differently. It's completely different texts for completely different reasons, and coming from completely different sources. Nephi writes 2 books. And so you have the book of Nephi, and in Nephi's inimitable way, the book of Nephi, just like you have the plates of Nephi, and I made other plates, and I called them the plates of Nephi. Man had no naming, imagination whatsoever. The other thing that's interesting about Nephi, if you go through the original chapters, and that's another thing that happens in Plates of Mormon, is I go with the original chapters, the original headers, no other information. This is, what we have here. But those headers are original, and we have them buried in our text to the point where we kind of don't see them, which is sad because they're really important to understanding why the text is constructed the way it is. But in Nephi, if you go back to the original chapters, if you go to every chapter that Nephi wrote, with one single exception, every chapter that he wrote, somewhere within the first 4 verses, he says, I, Nephi. Dang, buddy, we already remember. We know who you are. But every single chapter he wrote, somewhere it's, and I, Nephi, got it. We know who you are. I, Nephi, got it. Nobody else is that ridiculous about sticking his name in, but Nephi is. Mormon, and this is what's fascinating and where you know that we've really lost something. We have the Book of Mormon. We don't even find out who's writing this text until 3rd Nephi. It's the first time Mormon introduces himself in what we have. Could not have been the way it was. So if you go back to what we were talking about, what have we lost on the 116 pages? Yeah. We lost an introduction. There had to be an introduction where Mormon says, I am Mormon, this is what I'm doing. And we don't have it, but it had to have been there. Because you don't find out who's writing the book until it's almost over.
Yeah.
That's, anyway. So we were talking about the why things change. Well, that goes back to what have we lost in the Book of Mosiah. Well, first of all, why is it called the Book of Mosiah? Dynastic change. Who was the one who was part of the dynastic change? Well, the first Mosiah, which means that book had to begin with the story, at least the story of the meeting in Zarahemla with the people of Zarahemla, and then becoming king. And it had to be a lot more information than what we get out of Omni. So we have in Omni somebody else's description of that historical event, but it would have been in Mosiah. So that those little pieces that we have in Mosiah of everybody coming together and the people of Zarahemla had lost their language and lost their God, we get the basics in a few verses. It had to have been a couple of chapters. But yeah, that's what we lost in the Book of Mosiah, is that beginning story. Now, the rest of what we lost is this massive war that immediately precedes King Benjamin's speech. We start with King Benjamin's speech and we skip over everything else until we get to them, because this is really cool. Start with King Benjamin's speech. But what we miss is the fact that there was a devastating civil war prior to that time. They had wars with Lamanites, but this is one where, in addition to that, a large part of their population has left. And so people have lost families, and there's all kinds of devastation. And that becomes the motivation for Benjamin saying, okay, we have to do something to reunify this people that has been split by this terrible war. And so I'm going to give this speech where I'm going to make you a new people, and I'm going to give you a new name so that you are a new unified people. That's what he's doing. But the description of that war, we get very little of it. We get the tail end of it. Now, that's the other thing that's kind of fascinating, because as we are recording this, the Come Follow Me is talking about the war chapters in the Book of Mormon. And everybody goes, man, Mormon spends so much time on war. Why does he do that? And what's fascinating is Mormon really doesn't care about war at all. Prior to when we get to the war chapters, he discusses this really terrible war that was so bad that everybody is lamenting. And this great, oh, that I were an angel speech is coming at the end of that because of all of the sorrow he has for this devastating war.
That we don't talk about.
That he doesn't say much about, other than there was a terrible war and it was awful. And then we get the war chapters. Well, if he doesn't care about war, why do we get all this? Well, and I think there's two reasons. One is it's very obvious that there's a bromance going on with Captain Moroni. Mormon names his son Moroni. That should be a clue that he thinks that Captain Moroni was a pretty cool guy. And so there's a lot that he puts in there that I suspect is hero worship because of this. But
so he's kind of a George Washington? Captain Moroni is kind of a George Washington?
Yeah, figure? That kind of thing, yeah. You tell the story because he's very important. And what Mormon cares about when he writes about war are the people who are in it. And so he cares about Moroni. And so Captain Moroni, we get his story, and we learn why he was a great man. What did he do that was good? And so it's the goodness of Moroni, it's his valor, it's his standing up for the principles of his country, to stand up against the people who were trying to take away their freedom to live their religion. And in the ancient world, religion and politics were exactly the same thing. The king was, and then, chief judge, they're the other ones who are in charge of the religion. So it's, if somebody comes in, they're going to conquer us, and they're going to take away our right to govern ourselves and our right to our religious beliefs. And so he's standing up for that, and this is obviously a good thing. We also get the opportunity to have the story of Helaman in there. And a lot of times I think we make a mistake because we don't ask the question of why did Mormon put that story there? We too often think that the Book of Mormon occurs the way it does because that's the way the history was, and so Mormon just wrote the history. Well, Helaman did this, so we write it. Helaman was on a completely different front of the war. Moroni is off on the eastern seaboard fighting his battles, and Helaman is on the southwestern seaboard fighting all of his battles. And so they're in two completely separate places. why does Mormon do that? Well, he wants to tell Helaman's story, not because of Helaman, but because of the stripling warriors. Well, yeah, we love the story of the stripling warriors, and I'm not exactly sure why. We don't, I think, really understand it the way Mormon hoped we would. We also have arguments, I guess, about how old a stripling is. And I saw someone recently that was looking, and he says, oh, yeah, based on such and such, they might have been, 17, 18, 19 years old. That's not very miraculous. That's the age we send everybody off to war. I mean, in the United States, we sent those people off to Vietnam. We don't mind. It's not a shock to send somebody from, 18 to 22 off to war. Yeah, sure, go. So you're not miraculous if you're sending that stripling warrior off. That's what the armies are typically made of. That's you're a man at that age in the ancient world. In the ancient world, most people are going to live to 40. You're middle-aged at 20. So if you look at it, anyway, my guess is based on when the covenant was made, et cetera. Anyway, I think they were probably 12 to 14. Now, you look at those
stripling
deacons.
warriors were that young?
Oh, yeah. And you look at the deacons, if they're passing the sacrament, man, you go, stick a shield on that thing and tell him to defend me? Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, you want a miracle? Yeah, look at a 12 to 14-year-old who's saying, I'll go fight. Now, why does Mormon put that story in? Well, yeah, there's miracles, but who are the stripling warriors? They are the children of the people that we first meet as anti-Nephi Lehis, who are converted Lamanites. And Mormon is saying these converted Lamanites are righteous and they keep their covenant. They made a covenant to lay down their weapons of war, and they will keep that. Their sons didn't make the covenant, so their sons can go off. But the story of the sons is, they are now Nephites. And they are fighting for the Nephites. But their parents were Lamanites. And this is where I go back to say our ideas about what a Lamanite is and what they're supposed to be, they shift, or they're colored by Nephi, who has to set up and distinguish his people from another people. And anytime you're setting up a city in sort of the old world, if you're trying to make a new ethnos, a new people, one of the things you do is you make this new people over and against someone else. You need an enemy. And so who's the enemy? Well, the Lamanites. And who's a Lamanite? Well, we have the names, but basically Lamanite is sort of like Jew and Gentile. If you're a Jew, who is a Gentile? Anybody else? If you're a Nephite, who is a Lamanite? Anybody else? Do they have to be descended from Laman or Lemuel or Ishmael? Nah, doesn't matter. Anybody else? But with Nephi, they had to be an enemy. Mormon has a very different purpose. Mormon is writing to someone, and when he writes to someone, to whom is he writing his entire book?
Us.
Okay? Well, we get the Jew and the Gentile when Moroni gives it in the title page. But read what Mormon wrote as his farewell. It's all to the Lamanites, to my brethren, the Lamanites. He's writing to the Lamanites. Now, if Mormon is writing to the Lamanites, what message is he going to tell them? It was, 2 or 3 years ago. I was at a Sperry conference, which has now been renamed Come Follow Me in honor of Sidney Sperry, but it was the Sperry Symposium at the time, which is a lot easier to say. And it just so happens, like you and I met at a class, this friend of mine was there, and he's of, I believe, Mexican-American descent, and came up to me, and he says, I was going to ask you, he says, am I really that bad? I'm a Lamanite. I can identify as a Lamanite. I'm a Lamanite. Am I really that bad? And the answer is, well, no. And if you read what Mormon is doing, this overarching story that Mormon wants to tell, it's the absolute redeemability of Lamanites to come back to the covenant and to be part of the fold. And he emphasizes and makes sure we understand that repentant Lamanites who accept the gospel can be better than the Nephites, not just become Nephites, but better than the Nephites. And so we get the story of the anti-Nephi Lehis, and they're wonderful, and they have this really strong testimony. They do things the Nephites won't do. And then later we have Nephi and his brother Lehi who go back to the Lamanites, and they convert Lamanites, and they are also sufficiently righteous that they lay down their weapons. And Mormon doesn't emphasize that story, but he does want us to see that they're parallel and to understand this happened more than once. And if it happens more than once, it's not a fluke. This parallel means that it can happen again. And they laid down their weapons of war. And so they become more righteous. Well, how righteous were they? Where does Samuel the Lamanite come from? Samuel the Lamanite comes to the Nephites, and here are Lamanites who have converted to the gospel, who are sufficiently righteous that they send a prophet to the Nephites. So what is Mormon's message to his future brethren, the Lamanites? You can be redeemed. God loves you. The covenant's still waiting for you. There's nothing wrong with you. You simply have to accept the gospel, be baptized, do what Christ wants you to do, come into the fold, renew yourselves in the covenant, and you can be better than the Nephites ever were. That's Mormon's message, which is really far away from the let's establish them as the enemy that you get in Nephi. Okay, that was a lot of tangents. What do we want to do now? Now what?
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Brant-Gardner. He's the author of Plates of Mormon, as well as a commentary on the Book of Mormon. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the scripture white and delightsome. Is that a racist scripture?
It's a racist reading.
Okay.
And the only thing I was even mildly disappointed about when I read his book is there is a footnote when he's talking about that, and he says there are some modern scholars who are talking about how this is metaphorical in the Book of Mormon and not related to skin pigmentation. And I actually got my name mentioned.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.